The mission civilisatrice, civilizing mission, was a French colonial doctrine used to justify the expansion and control of territories, particularly in West Africa, by asserting the superiority of French culture, language, and values. This policy of cultural assimilation had profound and lasting impacts on the societies it aimed to civilize. Below are detailed stories and examples of how these assimilation policies were implemented and their effects on various West African regions. The École William Ponty in Dakar, Senegal, was a premier institution designed to train African students to become French-style administrators. Founded in 1903, the school embodied the French belief in the transformative power of education. The curriculum emphasized French language and culture, history, and values, aiming to create a class of educated Africans who would serve as intermediaries between the French authorities and the local population. However, this education came at the cost of erasing indigenous knowledge, languages, and cultural practices. Graduates of the school often found themselves caught between two worlds, alienated from their cultural roots and not fully accepted by the French. In Côte d'Ivoire, French colonial authorities established a network of primary schools where the medium of instruction was exclusively French. Indigenous languages were banned, and students were taught to see French culture as superior. The educational system aimed to produce loyal subjects of the French Empire who would adopt French ways of thinking and living. This approach led to a generation of Ivorian children growing up with a diminished sense of their cultural identity, often unable to speak their native languages fluently. French Catholic missionaries played a significant role in the cultural assimilation policies in Burkina Faso. These missions established churches and schools, promoting Christianity and French culture. Indigenous religious practices were discouraged, and converts were often expected to abandon their traditional beliefs. The Catholic Church's influence extended into social practices, such as marriage and burial rites, further embedding French cultural norms into the daily lives of the Burkinabe people. This religious conversion process disrupted traditional spiritual systems and created divisions within communities. In Togo, Protestant missions also contributed to the French assimilation efforts. These missions emphasized education and healthcare, providing services that were tied to conversion to Christianity. Indigenous practices were labeled as pagan and backward, leading to a decline in the practice and transmission of traditional knowledge. Converts often face social ostracism from their communities, furthering the cultural divide initiated by the colonial administration. In Mali, the French colonial administration replaced traditional leaders with French-appointed chiefs who were more aligned with colonial interests. This policy undermined the authority of indigenous governance structures and eroded the social fabric of Malian society. The new chiefs were often seen as collaborators with the colonial regime, leading to resistance and resentment among the local population. The imposition of French laws and customs further marginalized local legal practices, disrupting long-standing judicial traditions. In Niger, French legal codes were introduced to replace traditional legal systems. The Code de l'Indigénat, for instance, imposed French judicial norms and procedures, often ignoring or outright dismissing indigenous laws and customs. This legal assimilation was part of a broader strategy to integrate the colony more tightly into the French Empire. However, it resulted in a legal dualism where colonial law conflicted with traditional practices, leading to confusion and resistance among the local population. Senegal, as one of the key centers of French colonial administration in West Africa, experienced extensive language policies aimed at promoting French as the lingua franca. Indigenous languages such as Wolof, Pulaar, and Serer were suppressed in public and official domains. The promotion of French was not just a means of communication, but a tool of cultural domination. It was believed that by speaking French, Senegalese people would adopt French ways of thinking and living. This policy had long-term effects on cultural identity, as many Senegalese today navigate a complex relationship between their indigenous heritage and the legacy of French colonialism. In Guinea, traditional festivals and ceremonies were often suppressed or co-opted by the French authorities. Festivals that celebrated indigenous culture and heritage were discouraged, as they were seen as potential sites of resistance to colonial rule. Instead, French national holidays and cultural events were promoted, aiming to instill a sense of loyalty to France. This suppression led to the decline of many traditional practices and a loss of cultural continuity. In Côte d'Ivoire, the French colonial administration implemented forced labor policies to develop the economy. Ivorians were compelled to work on coffee and cocoa plantations, often under harsh and inhumane conditions. The economic benefits of this labor primarily flowed to French settlers and companies, while the local population endured significant hardship. This exploitation disrupted traditional agricultural practices and social structures, leading to widespread poverty and social dislocation. Mali's rich natural resources, including gold and other minerals, attracted significant French interest. The colonial administration imposed systems of forced labor to extract these resources, with little regard for the well-being of the local population. The environmental degradation and social upheaval caused by this exploitation had long-lasting effects on Malian society, contributing to economic instability and social tensions that persisted long after independence. One of the most notable figures of resistance against French colonial policies in West Africa was Samurai Touré in Guinea. Touré led a prolonged military campaign against the French, opposing their attempts to impose cultural and political control. His resistance highlighted the deep-seated opposition to the French civilizing mission and its destructive impact on indigenous societies. Although ultimately unsuccessful, Touré's efforts are remembered as a significant symbol of anti-colonial resistance. The Fouta-Djallon region in Guinea also saw significant resistance to French colonial rule. The region's Islamic leaders and communities resisted the imposition of French cultural norms and legal systems, leading to periodic uprisings and rebellions. This resistance was rooted in a desire to preserve Islamic and local traditions in the face of French assimilation policies. The long-term effects of the mission civilisatrice in West Africa have been profound. Many West African nations faced an identity crisis post-independence, struggling to reconcile their indigenous heritage with the French cultural legacy imposed during colonial rule. This has led to ongoing debates about language, education, governance, and cultural preservation in the post-colonial era. The French colonial education system has left a lasting legacy on contemporary education in West Africa. Many countries continue to use French as the language of instruction in schools, and the educational curricula often reflect a colonial bias. This has implications for national identity and cultural continuity, as younger generations are educated in a system that still bears the marks of colonial assimilation. In response to the colonial legacy, many West African nations have seen cultural revival movements aimed at reclaiming and revitalizing indigenous traditions and practices. These movements seek to counteract the erasure of local cultures and restore a sense of pride and identity rooted in pre-colonial heritage. Efforts to preserve and promote linguistic diversity have gained momentum in West Africa. Countries like Senegal and Mali have undertaken initiatives to incorporate indigenous languages into education and public life, recognizing their importance for cultural identity and social cohesion. Post-independence legal reforms in many West African countries have sought to reconcile colonial legal systems with traditional justice practices. This has involved integrating customary laws and traditional dispute resolution mechanisms into the formal legal framework, aiming to create a more inclusive and culturally relevant legal system. The French mission civilisatrice in West Africa was characterized by policies of cultural assimilation that aimed to impose French culture, language, and values on the indigenous populations. These policies had far-reaching and often devastating effects on the societies they targeted, leading to the erosion of cultural identities, social disruption, and economic exploitation. Despite the end of colonial rule, the legacy of the mission civilisatrice continues to influence contemporary West African societies, shaping their ongoing struggles for cultural preservation, social justice, and national identity.